Hello, and thank you very much for allowing me to present today. My topic is Penelope Rich as the central muse of the Elizabethan sonnet sequence. As I'm sure many of you are aware, in the early 1590s there was an explosion of sonnet sequences published in London that was set off by the publication of Sir Philip Sidney's Astrophel and Stella in 1591. Shakespeare's sonnets is somewhat of an outlier in terms of publication dates, although in terms of compositional dates, many believe that they were begun sometime around the early 1590s. As Michael Spiller writes in The Development of the Sonnet, an introduction, Penelope Devereux, Lady Rich, who is certainly responsible for the erotic fascination that produced Sir Philip Sidney's Astrophel and Stella, may also thereby have been responsible for the whole Elizabethan sonnet sequence craze, for until she entered Sidney's life in the early months of 1581, neither he nor anyone else appears to have thought of writing a sequence of English sonnets in the Petrarchan style. Although Penelope's father, Walter Devereux, the first Earl of Essex, had wanted her to marry Philip Sidney, after the first Earl died massively in debt, Penelope's guardians arranged a marriage against her will in 1581 to Robert Rich in what would be a very unhappy and scandalous union. After dutifully providing her husband with an heir and spare with a string of children in the 1580s, by the end of the decade she would take a lover, soldier Charles Blount, with Robert Rich acquiescing, seemingly due to the power of Penelope's younger brother, Robert Devereux, the second Earl of Essex. It was Penelope who led the covert correspondence with James of Scotland in 1589, coining the code names of those involved, and it was Penelope whom Essex blamed for urging him on when the Essex uprising of 1601 failed. Between 1589 and 1595, Penelope and Charles had a very tumultuous relationship. Blount was positioned overseas much of the time, or in Portsmouth when in England, far away from Penelope. In 1593, it was reported that Blount was considering suicide due to their strained relationship and Penelope wanting to break from him. But from 1595 on, they reconciled and had a number of children in quick succession. Penelope Rich was one of the most libelled women of her day. You may remember this from Alexander Waugh's vulgar scandal talk. However, it was a Stratfordian professor, George Clowiter, who discovered it, and he described it as a hostile piece. As you can see, it contains a number of capital letters, and they spell out Penelope, Countess of Devonshire, Coitui, or available for sex. Southampton and Penelope were demonstrably close. Numerous letters between them exist, and as noted by Penelope's biographers, Penelope was the godmother to Southampton's first daughter, who was named Penelope in her honour. And when Penelope Rich died in 1607, Blount having died the previous year, they left behind several underage children to whom Southampton became guardian. Turning to the sonnet sequences now, as Joseph Sobran writes, during the 1590s, about 24 sonnet cycles, about 1,000 sonnets in all, were published in England. This has led scholars to speak of an Elizabethan sonnet craze. I studied these sonnets for a couple of years and was struck by their similarities of style, as well as by hundreds of recurrent images and turns of phrase. Over several years, I found about 3,000 such parallels amongst these poems. Many of them could hardly be coincidental. And as an example, he lists Thomas Lodge's Phyllis and Chloris by William Smith. And as you can see, they are very similar indeed. The publication that started the sonnet explosion in the early 1590s and was recalled due to controversial content, Philip Sidney's Astrophel and Stella is generally considered by Shakespeare's amongst the cream of the Elizabethan sonnet sequences. It's believed to have been written about 1582, probably at Wilton House. Hoyt Hudson's 1935 article, Penelope Devereux as Sidney's Stella, has persuaded much of academia that Penelope Rich was the model for Stella. Sidney played on the name Rich in his sonnets, most notably Sonnet 37, yet it was omitted in the early editions, possibly to try and suppress the connection between Penelope Rich and Stella. And as you can see, he uses the word rich 6 times in this sonnet. Hudson compiled a catalogue of evidence for Penelope Rich's Stella. For instance, in John Harrington's 1591 translation of Orlando Furioso, he writes, "Our English Petrarch, Sir Philip Sidney, offered comfort himself in his sonnets of Stella and called her inestimably rich." As Hudson writes, Harrington was an epigrammatist and knew how to introduce a pun subtly. Who can doubt that in this passage, which comes to a climax in the word rich, he is apprising the informed world that he is in on the secret. And interestingly enough, in the very next tribute to Sidney that mentions Stella, the word turns up again. This is in the Phoenix Nest, which reads, "Stella, a nymph within this wood, most rare and rich of heavenly bliss. The highest in his fancy stood, and she could well demerit this." Robert Greene seems to allude to Sidney's Sonnet 26 in a poem in his 1592 Philomela, which means nightingale, to which Rich was compared. Grosart declared Sidney's poem The Nightingale is certainly a song of the Stella series. Greene alludes to Sidney's reference to nature's design and his comparing Stella's 2 eyes to 2 stars. Greene also alludes to the painting Venus and Mars surprised by Vulcan, depicting a wife's unfaithfulness. Greene writes, "Venus did soothe up Vulcan with one eye, with the other granted Mars his wish of glee. If she did so whom Hymens did defy, think love no sin, but grant an eye to me." Grant an eye to me is suggestive of Penelope's sexual appeal and reputation as an unfaithful wife. By the time John Davies of Hereford published his Microcosmos in 1603, the technique of punning on Rich's married name had become common. Davies writes, "To descant or comment on thy name as many do, yet to be rich was to be fortunate." Turning to the publication History of Astrophel and Stella, in Sir Philip Sidney and the Circulation of Manuscripts, H.R. Woodhausen writes, "The personal and intimate nature of Astrophel and Stella, its ostensibly scandalous background obliquely hinting at Sidney's adulterous love for Penelope, Lady Rich, and her unhappy marriage to Robert, Lord Rich, all contributed to its complicated and difficult textual history." Columbarro notes that the first edition was suppressed, probably at the instigation of the Sidney family, while Penny McCarthy sees Nash's preface as the main culprit for the controversy. It was clearly part of the source of the enormous upset caused by the first edition. This edition, put out by Thomas Newman in the autumn of 1591, was immediately recalled by order of the Chancellor under pressure from the Sidney family. It seems, but was reissued very soon, minus the dedication and preface. McCarthy continues, "In the preface, Nash indulges in some rather odd teasing. He exclaims, 'Mercury hath Io, and Iopean belongeth to Astrophel.' Nash seems to imply, Astrophel has own glory, being now dead, but someone called Mercury has one Io, and that Stella is Io. And it should be clear from the upshot, the calling in of books, the alterations, that it was the potential identification of Stella with Io by a wider readership that was at the heart of the trouble anticipated by the Sidney family from publication of Newman's first volume. Many poets have compared Oxford to Mercury, such as Gabriel Harvey, while in his book Shakespeare by Hilliard, Leslie Hodgson devotes several chapters to Shakespeare being alluded to as Mercury. Mercury features in another highly controversial but often overlooked publication of 1591, Philip's Venus, whose author has not been identified. As McCarthy notes, contemporary readers would surely have thought of Philip Sidney as soon as their eyes lighted on the title. This begs the question, who is Philip's Venus? The central story of Philip's Venus is the expelling of wanton Venus from among their sacred society. This sounds nothing like Frances Walsingham, but fits Rich, who is the most libelled female aristocrat of her era. This Venus is compared with chaste Penelope from the Odyssey, to whom Rich had been compared by poets and composers from at least 1589. Venus had been courting the young Ganymede, who is also the name of a character in Richard Barnfield's The Affectionate Shepherd, identified by several scholars as Southampton. Philip's Venus contains more similarities to Shakespeare's Venus and Adonis, in which an older woman seduces a young nobleman. Also contained in the likely unauthorized volume of Astrophel and Stella were verses attributed to composer and poet Thomas Campion, Samuel Daniel, Fulk Greville, and the Earl of Oxford. Were they included due to sharing a muse? This deserves consideration. Thomas Campion was seemingly obsessed with Rich. In his epigrams, Campion wrote, rather salaciously, to Stella, "Do you wish your name included in my compendious verses, or does it suffice, delicious girl, to shine among lesser stars?" Campion would later solidify the connection between Stella and Penelope Rich in his work The Umbra or The Shade. There gleams from a green myrtle grove the British star Penelope, who by her face will sometime kindle the loves of Astrophel, and by her sweet voice will charm the Irish leader. Morpheus, taken by the grace of her surpassing beauty, stands transfixed and wonders that there should be born in one body so many beauties, all of which he hides away in his mind to remember. Astrophel and the Irish leader are easy to pass, but who is Morpheus, the god of dreams? And why is Campion making a point of Penelope Rich's fecundity? As John Arthos describes in his book Shakespeare's use of dream and vision, Shakespeare often evoked dreams in his work, with Hamlet's perchance to dream, and Prospero's where such stuff as dreams are made on, being a small sample, while Morpheus was most famous from Ovid's Metamorphoses, Shakespeare's favourite book. The next sonnet sequence to look at is Fulk Greville's Kylica, which was written around 52 at the same time that Sidney was writing Astrophel and Stella. The title page states it was written in his youth and familiar exercise with Sir Philip Sidney. While Sidney's Stella referred to a star, Greville's work had a similar astronomical setting, Kylica meaning the entire celestial sky. J.M. Purcell's article, Sidney's Astrophel and Stella and Greville's Kylica, details numerous pages of similarities between the two. He concludes that these similarities are indeed striking. This implies, I believe, that Greville and Sidney were in communication at the time of composition. Greville uses similar descriptions used by Sidney in his sonnet sequence. For example, "Not Atlas I, nor did I heaven bear. Kylica, 'tis true, once on my shoulder sat. Her eyes more rich by many carats were than stars or planets which men wonder at." Also included in the volume with the Kylica sonnets was Greville's lengthy and detailed letter to an honourable lady. Julie Crawford of Columbia University describes the letter as a coded piece of advice for elite subjects living under a too absolutist monarch that was directed to the Essex faction. Alexander Grossart titles the letter "Letter to an Honourable Lady, Lady Rich," and he writes, "The whole facts and strain of this extraordinary letter seem to determine that the Honourable Lady was the Lady Rich when she was contemplating a divorce for sake of Mountjoy." The next sonnet sequence to be looked at is Diana by Henry Constable, published in 1592. Constable met Penelope's brother Essex at university and became friends, and in 1589 Constable carried a Hilliard miniature of Penelope to James in Scotland as a sign of the alliance's support for his candidacy as England's next monarch. In the same year, Rich herself began writing ciphered letters to the king, calling herself Rialta in the hopes of securing his political approbation to her family and religious and political viewpoints. The first edition of Diana contained a poem, A Calculation upon the Birth of an Honourable Lady's Daughter, born in the year 1588. In manuscript it was entitled A Calculation of the Nativity of the Lady Rich's Daughter, born upon Friday in the year 1588. Margetts continues, Constable, like Sidney before him, took note in his sonnets of Penelope's golden hair, her black eyes, and punned on her married name. He reveals and conceals her identity in exclaiming, "Oh, that my song like to a ship might be, to bear about the world my lady's fame, that charged with the riches of her name, the Indians might our country's treasure be. No treasure, they would say, is rich but she." J.M. Purcell notes further connections between Rich and Constable sonnets. For instance, in Sonnet 10, he twice puns on the name Rich, and describes her two stars in chief, that is, on her head, which Philip Sidney had done. As Professor Jeremy L. Smith notes, Constable's dedication of Diana to Rich was made explicit in a manuscript of poetry prepared by his very good friend Sir John Harrington. Smith notes that the Harrington manuscript consists of 21 sonnets, appearing under the title Mr. Henry Constable Sonnets to the Lady Rich, 1589. Smith concludes that this has convinced literary scholars of Constable's purpose to cast Rich as his Diana. The next sonnet sequence to be looked at is Delia by Samuel Daniel, published in 1592. As mentioned earlier, some of Daniel's Delia sonnets first appeared in Sidney's Astrophel and Stella, along with verses by Thomas Campion, Fulke Greville and E.O., evoking the Earl of Oxford, and may be suggestive of them sharing a theme, muse, or both. In his 1598 collection of epigrams, Thomas Bastard, who ran into litigation for exposing the secrets of high-profile Londoners in print, seems to suggest Rich as Daniel's subject. He writes, Daniel, beside the subject of thy verse, with thy rich vein and style adorned so. Bastard's book is well worth reading, as several of his epigrams seem to allude to Penelope Rich. Rich would go on to play Venus in Daniel's Masque, Vision of the 12 Goddesses, in 1604. Ernest Honigman asks whether Delia should be considered as a sonnet cycle or as a more complex structure, and goes on to note the similarity and cross-referencing between Delia and Daniel's The Complaint of Rosamond, both published as one work, and argues that they should be interpreted as one larger discourse on the same subject. Michael Drayton connects Rosamond with Stella and therefore Penelope Rich in his Matilda of 1594, when he writes, Fair Rosamond, of all so highly graced, recorded in the lasting book of fame, which often meant infamy, and in our sainted legendary place, by him who strives to stellify her name, yet will some matrons say she was to blame, though all the world bewitched with his rhyme, yet all his skill cannot excuse her crime. The connection of theme within Delia and the Complaint of Rosamond also seems to be suggested in the satirical play The Return from Parnassus Part 1, in which the character Gallio, seen as a caricature of Southampton, botches a line from Shakespeare, to which a character responds, I think he will run through a whole book of Samuel Daniels. As Alexander Waugh states, this is likely a reference to Daniel's work Delia and Rosamond, Augmented Cleopatra, all three works of which Waugh contends contain allusions to Southampton and Rich. Immediately after, we have the following exchange. Compare Gallio's lines below left with lines 7 to 12 of Shakespeare's Venus and Adonis. They are nearly identical. The main difference is the line, the gods' fair riches, instead of the field's chief flower. Martha Crowe, in an article on Daniel's constant revising of his works, notes some of Daniel's rewriting of Delia after the controversial first edition of Astrophel and Stella, which contains some of Daniel's Delia sonnets. The Delia of the sonnets initially has all the excellencies that a sonnet-honoured lady should have, including locks of gold, but the fact that the poet has slightly changed the word amber to snary in Sonnet 14, golden to sable, and rich in fame becomes poor in fame, it looks as if he desired to shield her personality from too blunt a guess. Daniel was living at Wilton House under Mary Sidney's patronage whilst rewriting Delia, and as Margaret Hannay writes, Daniel's introduction, noting the formal ordering of those compositions at Wilton and other comments, are very ambiguous and may be suggestive of him hinting at censorship by the Sidney family, a theme that will resurface later. Numerous scholars such as David W. Birchmore see Edmund Spenser's allegorical Colin Clout's Come Home Again as alluding to Daniel and his muse. He writes, and there is a new shepherd late upsprung, i.e. Daniel, the which doth all afore him far surpass, appearing well in that well-tuned song, which late he sung unto a scornful lass. Yet doth his trembling muse but lowly fly, as daring not too rashly mount on high, and doth her tender plumes as yet but try in love's soft lays, and looser or wanton thoughts delight. Then rouse, that is, to tussle with a person in a sexual or flirtatious manner, thy feathers quickly, Daniel, and to what cause thou please thyself advance. But most meseems thy accent will excel in tragic plaints and passionate mischance. Daniel is being warned about his flirtatious muse, this scornful lass who is too scared to fly high, and with multiple allusions to sex and childbirth does not sound anything like the chaste Mary Sidney, who has sometimes been forwarded as Delia, but fits Penelope Rich very well. There are many examples in the epigrams of the 1590s as to the identification of Delia. However, I'd like to take as an example Samuel Shepherd's epigrams from 1651 to show just how far and how long this scandal seems to have been known. Shepherd wrote, "Shakespeare no glory was allowed, his son quite shrunk beneath a cloud." That's a very interesting sentence, and I wonder how Stratfordian scholars would interpret that. One of the epigrams by Shepherd is dedicated to Delia, and it reads, "Delia, alas, and art thou now grown poor, walking like a dejected forlorn whore? Have all thy lovers cast thee off, what all, and given thee unto the hospital? No presentations of gloves, tires, or pins. Now naught is left unto thee save thy sins. O heavy load now, Delia, thou dost find, they nothing have who want a virtuous mind." One critic noted that this epigram is describing a formerly rich and admired lady who has fallen from grace and has acquired a terrible sexual reputation. Since Delia was written in the 1590s, Lady Penelope Rich, who lost both wealth, reputation, and the name Rich when Lord Rich divorced her, and she attempted to marry Charles Blount to become the Countess of Devonshire, seems a likely candidate for the subject of the epigram. Virtue, virtuous being italicised in the original, is used in two of the Essex family's mottos and was as closely associated with the Essex family as truth was with the Oxford family. Another epigram is dedicated to Penelope and reads, "Why shouldest not thou as far renowned be as ever was the chaste Penelope, wife to Ulysses? This I do aver. By contraries thou imitatest her." So he is basically saying that there is someone called Penelope who is the complete opposite of the chaste and faithful wife, Penelope from the Ulysses myth. And another to my friend Theodore Vaux reads, "It is set down by heaven's just decree, the child of riot or vulgarity must be beggary or contemptible. Take caution, friend, for that man spends with shame, that with his riches doth consume his name." Given Shepherd's penchant for anagrams, he used the anagrammatic pseudonym Raphael Desmus often. One cannot help but wonder if Theodore Vaux is an anagram, author EDV Ox. After serving Mary Sidney, Daniel went on to Charles Blount's patronage. He was called before the Privy Council in 1605 after his play The Tragedy of Philotas was suspected of pro-Essex and anti-Cecil themes. Indeed, Pauline Croft writes that the treacherous dwarf portrayed in the play was likely a caricature of Robert Cecil. Daniel also wrote the poem Ulysses and the Nymph, to which the Penelope-Charles relationship had already been likened. The next sonnet sequence to look at is Phyllis by Thomas Lodge, published in 1593. Lodge wastes no time in Phyllis making possible allusions to Rich. Lodge's first sonnet setting the trend, playing on Rich and later associating her with eaglet's eyes, which are black. He writes, "Enrich yourselves and me by your self-riches, which are the thoughts you spend on heaven-bred beauty." And there's many more sonnets of that ilk in Phyllis. Philip Sidney's good friend Sir Edward Dyer also wrote a poem to Phyllis, which seems to show censorship of the word rich. The following is one stanza of 5 in the poem, and the only significant difference between the original version and the second version of the 200-plus word poem is that beauty's bravest bower becomes beauty's richest bower, indicating a likely censorship initially on the word rich, as you can see there. And strengthening this as describing Penelope Rich is that she was specifically praised in Britain's Bower of Delights of 1591. In his sonnets, Lodge introduces the myth of King Acrisius and Danae, which will be mentioned across numerous sonnet sequences of the 1590s. The story of King Acrisius is that, having only a daughter and anxious at his lack of male heirs, which prevents him from being able to pass on his kingdom to a son, he asks an oracle if his luck will change in the future. When the oracle tells him it will not, but that his daughter will have a son who will kill him, Acrisius locks his daughter away in an underground, richly adorned chamber. But Zeus, desiring her, descends down into the golden rain through the chamber and into her womb, impregnating her with a son. And we will shortly see how this becomes relevant. Lodge also wrote Wit's Misery in 1596, which contains a well-known allusion to Hamlet, but the passage in which it occurs is obscure and rarely quoted. It is entitled, "Of the great devil Beelzebub, and what monstrous and strange devils he hath bred in our age." There are multiple allusions to Shakespeare in this work about a man whose paternity of his children is in question. The next sonnet sequence to look at is Michael Drayton with his Ideas Mirror of 1594. As Diana Price writes in Shakespeare's unorthodox biography, like Shakespeare, Michael Drayton was born in Warwickshire. It is no wonder then that biographers suppose that Drayton and Shakespeare were well acquainted, even drinking buddies, but there is no evidence to support these assumptions. However, by 1591, Drayton appears to have become a member of the Essex Circle, dedicating his first work to Lady Jane Devereux, Essex's sister-in-law. In Charles Fitzgeoffrey's celebrated Sir Francis Drake of 1596, Fitzgeoffrey writes, "Golden-mouthed Drayton musical, into whose soul sweet Sidney did infuse the essence of his phoenix-feathered muse." Sidney's muse, of course, would be Stella or Penelope Rich. Drayton's association with Penelope Rich seems to be corroborated by a dedicatory poem linking Stellified and Rich in his second part of Polly Albion, which reads, and as you can see, there's an acrostic of Michael Drayton on the left, and it begins, "Must Albion, England, thus be stellified by thee?" And down the bottom, "Thou his rich subject." Ideas Latimus, published in 1595, was dedicated to teenager Lucy Russell, Countess of Bedford, close friend of Penelope and Dorothy, who performed with Penelope in Johnson's Mask of Blackness. It reads in part, "Shadowed with roses and sweet eglantine, dipping their sprays into this crystalline, Zeus's shower-begotten son, whose value tried, or judged, in 17 glorious lights art stellified." Jove's shower-begotten son refers to the myth we saw Thomas Lodge allude to of King Acrisius being disappointed by his lack of male heirs and culminating in Zeus impregnating her with a son. Drayton is linking this son with 17, Oxford obviously being the 17th Earl of Oxford, and stellified, associated with Penelope Rich, while shadowed with roses and sweet eglantine, a type of rose, is indicative of Southampton. The only time Drayton ever wrote of Shakespeare by name was in his Elegies upon Sundry Occasions in 1627. He writes, "Shakespeare, thou hadst as smooth a comic vein, fitting the sock, and in thy natural brain, as strong conception and as clear a rage as any one that trafficked with the stage." Trafficked meaning trade illegally, conspired, often pejorative. As Diana Price notes at the end of the poem, Drayton admitted he had not named certain poets who chose to circulate their manuscripts privately rather than publish, and by transcription daintily must go, as though the world unworthy to know their rich composures or compositions, let those men that keep these wondrous relics in their judgment deep. The next sonnet sequence to look at is the Amoretti by Edmund Spenser, one of England's most respected poets, and he wrote 88 sonnets, many of which celebrate unusually fulfilled sexual love achieved within marriage. Yet Spenser still took the opportunity to shadow his poems with allusions to Penelope, such as addressing one to Penelope about the Penelope and Ulysses myth, which had been associated with Penelope Rich and her long-distance love, Charles Blount, from the late 1580s. Spenser is alluded to in Richard Barnfield's The Affectionate Shepherd, dedicated to Rich and published in 1594. As we shall see in the section on Barnfield, its main argument is the homosexual poet Barnfield writing as his persona Daphnis, who is in love with Southampton, Ganymede, and warning Ganymede against Gwendolen, Penelope Rich, and her fickle treatment of suitors. The following passage alludes to Spenser. By thee, great Colin lost his liberty. By thee, sweet Astrophel, forewent his joy. By thee, Amyntas wept incessantly. By thee, good Rowland lived in great annoy. O cruel, peevish, wild, blind seeing boy, how canst thou hit their hearts and yet not see, if thou be blind as thou art fain to be? The poet is pleading with the blind seeing boy not to suffer the same fate as Colin, Astrophel, Amyntas and Rowland. Harry Morris, in an article in PMLA, writes there is mention of Spenser and Drayton as well as Amyntas and Sidney. I suggest that thee is Penelope Rich, the woman the boy is being warned about. Astrophel is evidently Sidney's persona, who forewent his joy when Penelope was married against her will to Robert Rich. Amyntas wept incessantly likely links to Thomas Lodge, who in his Phyllis sonnets of the previous year writes who in their swan-like songs Amyntas wept. We have seen the links between Lodge's Phyllis and Rich. Rowland living in great annoy links to Michael Drayton, whose poems, as we have seen, also links to Rich. In his 1593 idea, The Shepherd's Garland, Drayton devotes nearly a third of one eclogue to a scathing denunciation of how literary clientage can corrupt poetry. Several scholars have noticed Mary Sidney is alluded to in this work as censoring the poets from speaking openly. She had strong motivation to do so, considering Rich's increasingly scandalous reputation and her connection to Mary's late brother. Colin would be Spenser after his Colin Clouts Come Home Again. By thee, great Colin lost his liberty, I submit, is referring to Spenser's poem Astrophel in Colin Clouts Come Home Again and the lack of freedom Spenser had in associating Stella with Rich. At times in Spenser's Astrophel poem, Spenser implies Stella as Sidney's wife, who in real life was Frances Walsingham, not Penelope Rich. As Hoyt Hudson writes, it seems to me that Spenser, while by no means clearly saying that Sidney's Stella was Frances Walsingham, is clearly trying to spread the impression, or to leave the way open for the inference, that she is, yet his account of the death of Stella puts his treatment of the subject into the realm of fiction rather than of history. The story in Astrophel, then, is the poetic offspring of Spenser's gallant desire to keep Sidney's reputation free from all scandal and to honour Sidney's former wife, a definite effort to hush or to forestall stories about Sidney's having written his poems to someone else may be seen. Benjamin Sawinski, in his thesis A Study of Sir Philip Sidney's Astrophel and Stella, agrees. After Sidney's death, there seems to have been an attempt to dissociate him from the implications of his love poetry, or in other words, to whitewash him. Spenser seems then to be practising his own saying from the Fairy Queen, under one hood to shadow faces twain, conflating two personas into the one character. The next sonnet sequence to be looked at is Cynthia by Richard Barnfield. Barnfield was unique in Elizabethan England in that he openly revealed his homosexuality and wrote two of the most controversial works of the Elizabethan era, The Affectionate Shepherd and Cynthia. Both these books describe his love and lust for a young man whom he calls Ganymede, who is being aggressively courted by a beautiful older woman. In both books, he implores Ganymede to end his relationship with this woman. As Professor Stephen May notes, Barnfield's The Affectionate Shepherd, containing the complaint of Daphnis for the love of Ganymede, was published in 1594 and gave rise to objections by the poem's dedicatee, Lady Penelope Rich, and her lover Charles Blunt, that Barnfield had used them as models for two characters. Penny McCarthy notes that George Cloweder, Barnfield's recent editor, assumes that the poem is not only dedicated to Penelope Rich, but also relates her adventures in love. Michael Mooton contends that in The Affectionate Shepherd, Barnfield then alludes to Shakespeare as the old suitor who is wooing Gwendolen, Penelope Rich. Another arrow out of Cupid's quiver, the which was carried by the wind at will, and under death the amorous shaft did shiver, As Mouton points out, a shaft is the long, slender rod forming the body of a lance or spear, and to shiver is to tremble or to shake, which together with will gives the will Shakespeare. Yet Mouton, a Stratfordian scholar, misses the possible quiver and shiver wordplay on Vere's name. Mouton contends the triangular relationship between Gwendolen, Rich, Ganymede, Southampton, and the old suitor Shakespeare matches the triangular relationship in both Shakespeare's sonnets and Willoughby His Avisa, which features the characters W.S. and H.W., seen by many as representing William Shakespeare and Henry Roseley. In Cynthia Ganymede, Barnfield's love from the affectionate shepherd returns, and as with the affectionate shepherd, Barnfield expresses his homosexual love for Ganymede, making these two works two of the most controversial of the age, reducing the likelihood that the Cynthia sonnets are addressing Elizabeth, who is often portrayed as Cynthia. Barnfield uses the Sidneyan techniques of stars for eyes and potential puns on Rich, as you can see. The next sonnet sequence to be looked at is Diella by R.L. in 1596. Alexander Waugh argues that the Diella sonnets are likely written by Southampton as they are alluded to in the H.W. section of Willoughby His Avisa and in William Carville's Polymantia, and seemingly rebutted by Shakespeare in his Sonnet 130. And as we can see, Shakespeare's 130 seems to be answering or rebutting the Diella sonnets. Diella writes, "My mistress snow white skin." Shakespeare writes, "If snow be white, why then her breasts are done." Perhaps most importantly, Diella writes, "Her hair exceeds gold forced in smallest wire." And Shakespeare rebuts, "If hairs be wires, black wires grow on her head." Sonnet 130 is often used by many scholars as seemingly telling us what the Dark Lady looks like, and most conclude that she had dark hair because of this sonnet. But if Waugh is correct and Shakespeare is indeed rebutting the Diella sonnets, then it would seem that his muse actually has gold hair rather than black hair. I'm sure many of you are aware of Alexander's interpretation of Polymantia, so I won't spend too much time on it. Obviously, he found that court de verse can be read as R de Vere, and the remaining letters form an anagram of our secret. Samuel Daniel is mentioned quite a bit. His muse is obviously Delia, and Carville writes, "Whose sweet refined muse in contracted shape." And if you contract Delia, you get DLA. A at the time was often pronounced R, so phonetically we have Diella or the Diella sonnets. And then over the page, we have Rosamond, Cleopatra and Delia, which we recall from earlier were published as one work and were alluded to in the Parnassus plays as being connected to Southampton. Finally, the work reads, "Register your children's pedigree in fame's forehead," which again has a double meaning, as fame's also meant infamy and forehead was the seat of shame. The next sonnet sequence to look at is Laura by Robert Toft. Laura was the name of Petrarch's muse, Petrarch being seen as the exemplifier of Italian sonneteering. The sequence is dedicated to Lady Lucy, sister to the thrice renowned and noble Lord Henry, Earl of Northumberland, that is, the Wizard Earl. And he married Penelope's sister, Dorothy. Like Shakespeare, Toft compares his mistress's eyes to the blackness of the raven, and like Sidney compares her eyes to stars. As burnished gold, such are my sovereign's hairs, a brace of stars divine, her blackish eyes, like to the fairest black the raven bears, and down the bottom, through golden hair, black eyes, and breast most white. Thomas Campion, who we saw earlier, had published songs in Astrophel and Stella and wrote salacious epigrams to Stella, also wrote epigrams about Laura. For instance, "You sing wonderfully, Laura, but only in the dark. There's nothing you don't do well in the dark." Rich was noted for her singing voice, while the epigram concludes in a salacious manner similar to that of Campion's Stella epigrams and evokes blackness with which Rich was associated, her favourite colour being black. The next sonnet sequence is the Amorose by Alexander Craig, and Josephine Roberts notes that there is good reason to believe that they are alluding to Penelope Rich. In the sonnet there dedicated to Penelope, it says she is a lady rich, rich, wise and fair. While the double use of rich may be coincidental, the next sonnet suggests otherwise. It ends with, "O rain no more thy showers of gold on me. One kiss of thee would breed me more content than make me king of Croesus, Lydian rent." So again, he is evoking the myth of Danae and unable to procure an heir. Content is linked to the saying, content is rich. It was a common saying at the time, and there were two composers who dedicated songs to Penelope called Content is Rich, while King Croesus of Lydia was well known to the Elizabethans by the saying rich as Croesus, so there are multiple allusions to rich there. Professor Josephine Roberts agrees, writing a long article, The Artistry of Alexander Craig's Sonnets, detailing the links to Penelope Rich in Craig's poems, while also linking the poems to Shakespeare's Dark Lady. Which brings us to Shakespeare's sonnets. Obviously, I don't have time to analyse the sonnets. They require their own whole presentation, which I'd love to do, hopefully in the near future. I would like to draw your attention to the work of the German Oxfordian Kurt Kryler. He's noted numerous allusions to Shakespeare's sonnets by many of the sonneteers of the 1590s, and they do seem to be alluding to the sonnets, and I've found a lot more allusions to the sonnets that I'd really like to go through, particularly with reference to Penelope Rich. So in terms of conclusions, references to Diana and Cynthia should not be automatically assumed to be alluding to Elizabeth. Shadowing one person under the guise of another was a common form of esoteric writing, such as Spenser's maxim, "Under one hood to shadow faces twain." The poets of the sonnet sequences were aligned with the Essex faction and opposed to the Cecils. In a further talk, I'd like to expand on the notion that Mary Sidney was censoring the poets, including Shakespeare, and I found some evidence suggesting that Mary Sidney suppressed Oxford's authorship of Venus and Adonis. Potential allusions to Penelope Rich should be researched and examined further. For instance, we all know Thomas Edwards in his Envoy to Narcissus of 1595, add-on deftly masking through stately tropes, rich conceited. There are many others to look at. For example, the changeling or hidden baby in A Midsummer Night's Dream is sometimes put forward to support a hidden royal baby, yet the words used to describe it play on Rich multiple times and evoke Constable poems of Penelope Rich, such as Titania's speech below. Ben Jonson seems to have descanted on Penelope Rich's name. In his second folio, published posthumously, he wrote an epigram to the honoured blank Countess of blank, perhaps censored due to the scandalous nature of the lady. And it begins, "The wisdom, madam, of your private life," and then it continues, "as makes Penelope's old fable true, while your Ulysses hath taken leave to go." And at the bottom, "the same it was, inspired, rich and refined." So we don't know when the epigram was written, but the failure to name the subject, the talk of her private life, the allusion to Penelope and her deceased Ulysses, Blunt died in 1606, Penelope the following year, and Rich make it seem likely that the title should read, "To the honoured Penelope, Countess of Devonshire." One of the sonnet sequences we didn't have time to look at was Chloris. There are many allusions to Rich in that work, but Johnson would write a masque on Chloris, in which he wrote that Chloris was to be stellified on earth, and upon this hinge the whole invention moved. It's a very interesting work. I'd highly recommend it to you all. So thank you very much for watching, and finally I'd like to dedicate this talk to Alexander Waugh, a true genius and someone I'm sure we all miss greatly. Thank you.